All right, everyone. Last night I watched most of the Tucker interview of Vladimir Putin that dropped, and it was within an hour of it dropping. I was watching it. I would say, it was interesting, and good on him for actually doing the journalism thing that a lot of journos won't. I know that like the BBC and some other sites are like, well, we queried Vladimir Putin and asked him for interviews for years, and he always said no. Well, I wonder why. The funny thing is, the charge levied against Tucker Carlson is he's a lapdog for Putin. He's basically a Russian state agent. How dare he? Because he's independent. He's no longer under contract with Fox or anything like that, so he's not supposed to talk to people that we don't like. The juxtaposition is, do you think Vladimir Putin's going to get a fair interview from the BBC that's not going to get edited to pieces for a Western audience? Tucker provided it pretty much in raw form. There's very little editing involved. I would note that the body language involved, Tucker was actually fairly skeptical of some of Putin's claims, and the first half hour of the interview actually is mostly Vladimir Putin pontificating about historical things. He seems to have a wide-reaching knowledge of the history of Poland, actually, but the Polish appear to be his whipping boy with regards to what's going on in Ukraine. No, you heard that right. If you haven't seen the interview for yourself, I was as confused as Tucker was at times. And he was trying to be amenable and polite, because when in Rome, do as the Romans do. If you're in Russia talking to the Russian leader, it's probably not a good idea to antagonize him. You might end up Gonzalo Lira, only in reverse. But that dynamic didn't really metastasize or anything. Vladimir appeared annoyed a couple of times, and Tucker actually appeared annoyed a couple of times. It was a friendly interview in general. There were a couple of moments where both of them lost their cool a little bit, because Vladimir Putin wants to hold a monologue. Tucker wants to ask a bunch of questions and doesn't really understand what Putin's even hinting at. I guess the idea in Putin's mind with regards to the Ukraine war is that Ukraine shouldn't exist at all, effectively. Well, it was a term for borderlanders and border patrols and stuff like that. We called them Ukrainians, and there was no Ukrainian nation. And by the way, it's partially historical. But I would like to mention one big thing that Putin glossed over. He talks about Stalin and some of the nationalization of language thing and stuff related to it. And he talks about Hitler, of course, because that's in the context of the formation of some of these countries and their borders and things like that. He's about Hungary, how other countries ceded land to Ukraine, which is true. I mean, he's correct on that one. There's land in Ukraine that used to belong to several other nations, Romania, Hungary, and so forth. And Tucker explicitly asked him, oh, should they take back their land? He's like, oh, I don't know that that's a good idea. I don't know. That was their land, but I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying that several European countries should curb stomp the Ukrainians while we invade from the other side. There was an insinuation there. It's not going to happen, but there was an insinuation. But one thing he glosses over. He very deftly avoids mentioning one real big glaring thing, especially in regards to Poland, which is that the Germans under the Nazi Party and the Russians under Stalin had a peace agreement, which was violated and fell apart, and then war began. But originally, they had a non-aggression pact. Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression treaty. By the way, to all you tankies out there, the leftoids that lurk on the channel, are you comfortable with supporting the Great Red Menace Soviet Army sort of bullshit thing when you disclaim Hitler as being a leftoid, but he managed to sign an agreement with Stalin while it fell through with the other countries in the area, the monarchies in the Western world, like the democrats, so-called republics of the world? I notice it's a very, very telling who Hitler decided to have a peace agreement with now, isn't it? The bunch of Asians outside of Europe, supposedly, again, he hated everyone who wasn't white with blue eyes and blonde hair. He signs, though, military agreements with the communists and a bunch of Asians. Well, there you go. It's very telling. I wonder why that wasn't worked into the interview. I wonder why Putin didn't bring that up. No, but the interview was good overall. And again, I watched most of it. It's almost 2 hours long. And mostly, though, it's Putin holding a monologue for the first quarter of it. And Poland, for some reason, sticks in his craw. He seems to have a problem mainly with the Polish. He's like ambivalent on the Ukraine. He's like, oh, Ukraine doesn't exist. No problem with them. They speak Russian, and we're just trying to take back what's our land anyway under military agreements from several hundred years ago. but he keeps going back to the topic of Poland. I'm sitting there, I'm like, I like the Polish. I think that they're based. Also great food. Carpathian Mountains and all that cool shit. Love to visit Poland someday. Love to see the mountains and the valleys. I want to go see Krakow. It looks cool to me. Poland is pretty cool. And then we've still got hussars, I think. For decoration mainly, but they're there. Apparently they're very effective against tanks, drawing them off to prevent civilians from dying. By the way, the idea of them charging the tank columns with lances is only semi-canonical. They were trying to distract the Nazi tanks and the commie tanks so the civilians could flee. They were largely successful in this, and most of them died, and so they died as true heroes. The look on Carlson's face is probably the best thing about the interview. And again, this is for the entire first quarter. Mainly you're looking at Tucker Carlson in between shots, showing Putin, and he's pontificating about all of this history, the Rus, and the formation of Ukraine, dissolution of parts of Poland to Germany, etc., etc., and then back to Poland. He's talking about this. Tucker Carlson's got... He's got that look on his face. You remember the Tim Scott town hall, where Tim Scott was supposed to sit down and talk to Tucker. And this seems to be a thing that Tucker has to fucking suffer through repeatedly in his interviews. He's supposed to be talking to a person, but then they hold a monologue, and they're mainly like they're pontificating to the audience, as opposed to having like a true one-on-one, heart-to-heart sort of convo with him. It happened with Tim Scott. Tim Scott was supposed to sit down next to Tucker and address him. Instead, he gets up, and he tigers around back and forth on the stage like a televangelist, speaking to the crowd, speaking to the audience that's watching both locally and digitally. And Tucker Carlson had that same exact look on his face, a look of total bewilderment. He's like, I don't understand what's going on. But he's a good interviewer, so he's trying to be amenable. He extended that courtesy to Tim Scott instead of saying, hey, Tim, I'm over here. This chair is here for a reason, by the way. You're supposed to sit down and look at me. Instead of talking to the audience. And he just sits there, listens politely, interjects occasionally, and eventually Tim Scott calmed down. The same happened with Putin. It's exactly the same dynamic. Like, Putin would get along with Tim Scott, I think, unless they're competing. If they're on stage together supporting each other, they'd be best friends. They'd be enemies in any other situation, vying for the spotlight, I suppose. So imagine Trump's behind closed doors conversations with him, apparently threatening to bomb Moscow if Ukraine was invaded. I bet the Ukrainians low-key wish that Trump were still the president. I know that I do. I think everyone does at this point, based on the DOJ report last night. If you're still riding with Biden, I don't know, you're more nuts than him, and he's, one marble shy of a full bowl. But the same thing happened. Putin is effectively holding a historical monologue justifying the war. And the times when Tucker interjects, like, oh, I don't understand exactly what this has to do with what's going on now. You had 20 years, you've been in office for a long time. Only lately did you actually launch this invasion of eastern Ukraine. And Putin, each time, Putin's like, well, let me explain. Oh, yes, let me explain further, because I am a student of history of Eastern Europe and Russia. And it was strange at times, but it was definitely entertaining. I'll probably watch it again tonight, go back through it and catch anything that you missed. Watch the end. I didn't watch the last 20 minutes, but overall a good interview. I can see why the legacy media is so upset that he got the interview and they didn't. Because he actually allowed Putin to speak instead of continuously talking over him. And keep in mind Putin's personality. It's similar to Donald Trump's. The big man in the room personality, not ideologically, of course. When you're talking to Putin, you can't just talk over him and cut him off. You have to give him a little bit of a platform, a little more leeway. And again, it goes back to that concept. There's a cultural difference. When you're in someone's house, especially a powerful person's house, and you're in Eastern Europe, you're in most of Asia, etc., you let them have the floor. You are subjugate to them. You're on their turf. You have to let them speak. It's not the same. You're interviewing Emmanuel Macron and you cut him off and you talk over him. He gets a little bit annoyed, but nothing happens. Nobody gives a shit. You're talking to, I don't know, Mark Rutte or Merkel or somebody like that. It's understood there's more of a dialogue. In the Eastern, it's more of a monologue. And so unless you're also a big, powerful man like a Donald Trump figure, Tucker Carlson kind of is, you've got to listen. You can't simply hold your monologue over them when you're ostensibly in their house interviewing them. Another reason why Biden and similar other so-called Western leaders right now fail to grasp the full situation that's going on in many parts of the world. That's about all. Peace out.